Mm. I mean, what's the end game there?
That's trans housing.
I mean, where are they located?
Wait a minute, hang on. They live in New York. Yeah, this is another kid that, you're right, January is getting
The lawsuit that I have it up too. It's the child's name is Cameron. At least that's what
yes.
it says here.
And the mom's name is Chloe, C-O-E, but that the child, Bella, was another plaintiff, supposed to
Mm.
scheduled to have the puberty blocking implant. And
Oh
it's
yeah, Bo and
big
Co.
about the Cameron kid. Cameron is non-binary, is receiving and was scheduled to receive medically necessary care.
Right.
Whatever that
These
is.
these must be made up names. Bo, Co, and Roe. I mean, what are
Yeah,
the chances? I
right.
think they must be fake
Seen that.
names to protect their privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Ooh, I hear Jamie just got here. We're hosting Jamie Reed. She came out to testify for a really common sense malpractice, refusing malpractice insurance to doctors who practice gender affirming care on minors.
Okay. Are we live, Gavin? Didn't see your thumbs up.
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone joining us today. Fair for All is a nonpartisan organization with the mission of safeguarding our civil liberties and promoting truth, transparency, and a fair and balanced viewpoint. Newly inaugurated President Trump signed several dozen executive orders in his first couple of weeks in office. This webinar is a part of a series informing you about how this administration's policies impact our work at Fair for All. I am Dr. Nikki Johnson, your host and the co-director of Fair in Medicine. My guests today understand the impact of gender medicine on children and what parents face as they try to protect their children from gender ideology. They will help break down the effects of the president's executive orders and new health policy leadership on protecting children from the harms of gender medicine. We will explore what else needs to happen to change medical, public health, and school guidelines and policies. Please welcome Erin Lee and January Littlejohn. Erin Lee is a speaker, a writer, and a mother of three from Northern Colorado. She is the founder of Stop Gender Ideology and the executive director of Protect Kids Colorado. She has told the story of rescuing her 12-year-old daughter from transgender grooming in public school on Fox News, Glenn Beck, Newsmax, Daily Wire, and the Epoch Times. Oh, and the Daily Mail UK. She also released a film last year about their story called Art Club. Erin travels the country, awakening parents to what's happening in government schools and fighting back against gender ideology. January Littlejohn is a senior fellow for Do No Harm. She's focused on the harms of gender affirming care. She has a background in mental health counseling and is a wife and a mother of a teenage daughter who was socially transitioned in public school at her public middle school without her mother's knowledge. January has been a guest panelist for Fair in Medicine in the past. She was our guest panelist when we discussed the gender toolkit back in the spring. Welcome to both of you.
It's great to be with you, Nikki. Thank you so much for having us.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. So I think a lot of, often we see a lot of professionals talking in this sphere of kind of a political language, but medical language. But we don't often hear from the parents who are active and understand the landscape here. And also have been personally affected by a lot of these policies that we think are harming children. So as a parent, I don't expect you to be experts at, and you know, especially non-attorney parents. I don't expect you to be experts in what the information that's in the executive orders or any of the lawsuits that are coming out. But I would like to get your opinion as an expert on behalf of your children and other people's children. So my first question to start things off is, as a parent, what was your initial reaction to Trump's executive orders on, the first one was defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. And the second one was protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. What were your initial, reactions to these executive orders? And then what was your initial thought about how your local government or how the general public, how the medical establishment, healthcare establishment would respond to these orders? And either was
Yeah, so I'll go first to get us started. I'm so grateful to be here with Erin. She's such a warrior. And, there are a lot of parents now that are fighting this fight, some behind the scenes and some publicly, like Erin and myself. But my initial reaction was one of hope. I think this has been a day that parents who have been impacted this have been waiting a long time. And as Abigail Schreier recently wrote, I hope that this spell is broken because this entire medical abuse scandal is based on multiple lies. And it's going to take more than executive orders to root these lies out of our society, not just our schools, but our medical fields, our psychological fields, and even our judicial system. And so that's going to take some time, but I think these executive orders were a great first step and a necessary step. It was very clear that President Trump's and his administration has people there that know what they are talking about, that understand this issue through and through, because these were very thorough and well-written executive orders. And so we, of course, know that this is not the end all be all, that there are other steps that need to be taken and I believe will be taken. But I thought this was a great first step. I know many parents were celebrating these steps. This was one of the most important issues of this election for many parents like Erin and myself. And so it was one of hope, but it's also been tragic to see parents that also know it's too late for their kids.
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, hope was my first reaction. It's almost like parents like us have been hiding in the shadows, where we've been silenced and we've been called every hateful name in the book for standing up for our own kids. And now that we have the federal government on our side versus really against us, I mean, you'll remember the Department of Justice was weaponized against parents who spoke up when their kids were being harmed in public schools. And so it just feels like it's a new day where we don't have to hide in the shadows anymore, and our voices are going to be elevated. Our stories are going to be elevated. And to January's point, we're out and loud about what happened to our daughters, but there are thousands of parents like us across the country who are still stuck in the trenches with their children. We're two of the lucky ones whose daughters have desisted. We are on the other side of this darkness, but there are so many parents who are still dealing with it. And this gives me hope that there will be better resources, better data. People will be less afraid to speak the truth and to talk about these other family stories. So we're going to see a cultural shift, but as January said, federal legislation, even state and local legislation isn't enough. We are going to have to change the culture if we want to eradicate, gender ideology harming our children.
Okay, awesome. All right, now hold off on that because we'll get back to what we think is necessary to actually get this through. But I love everything that both of you said. So let's do a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about what's in the orders. We're not going to go through both of them entirely because there's a lot of language in there. But I really want to emphasize the firm language that left sort of no question about what the administration stood for on this. And I want to get your response to that. So in the defending women from gender ideology and extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government, that was the very first one that came out on this subject on January 20th. Section 1, I mean, right off the bat said, basing federal policy on truth is critical to scientific inquiry, public safety, morale, and trust in government itself. And then the second issue that I wanted to point out is actually the definitions. It is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. Then it goes on to define sex, male, female, boy, woman, man, gender identity, and multiple other things. And they protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation, just that language itself is very strong. The order, that specific order ordered institutions that were receiving federal research or education grants to terminate all efforts that support gender affirming surgery procedures and care for minors, and use the language chemical and surgical mutilation. So what have you seen? What was your response, to that language in particular? Because you both said to me that these executive orders gave you hope, that you were being heard on a national level, and at least something was changing on a federal level. But a lot of people are critical, especially people who are sort of in the center or still believe that there needs to be a line, a fence that's straddled on this issue. That this language is very, very harsh. It's very, very firm. What do you think? Do you think this is language that is going to help move the conversation along? Is it going to create a backlash that's going to be much more fierce than what it has been?
Well, Nikki, when it comes to reality, we have to be firm in the truth. And it's amazing to me that we're even at a place in society where we have to define clearly what a male and female is. And it just shows how this radical pseudoscientific ideology had really infiltrated all aspects of our society. And so that was absolutely necessary. Sex is not a spectrum, sex is binary. It cannot change. And that is just one of the lies on which this entire medical scandal was based. And so, no, I don't think it was divisive. We have to have objective truth and reality. Otherwise, it leads to an enormous amount of chaos that we are seeing play out in real time with unregulated experiments on vulnerable children that could have been happening on kids like my daughter and Aaron's daughter. So it was necessary. The language in the second executive order that you discussed, we were all celebrating. I know that I and many parents cried happy tears that day because let's be very clear. The US and our approach to treating this type of distress in minors, we are a complete outlier versus how it's being approached from the rest of the world. And so this issue should have never been politicized. And I can promise you, it is not a political issue for parents that Aaron and I speak with from all political backgrounds all over our country. But it was an intentional language to say and call it what it is. They are mutilating children. They are poisoning their body in the name of so-called gender identity. So not only was it important to define clearly what sex is, that it is immutable, it cannot be changed, but also to get this pseudoscientific idea of gender identity out of our laws, out of the language that we use, because that's the second lie on which this is all based.
Yeah, two things that really jumped out at me. That first executive order, male and female, like January said, I also cried happy tears, which is bizarre because it's the truth. And for so long, we've been suppressed into feeling like we couldn't speak the truth. And so something that really stuck out to me was Section 5 of that first executive order that encourages the Attorney General to issue guidance ensuring freedom of speech for people to speak biological truth. And as I said, the way that we're going to win this battle is through a cultural and societal shift. And that starts with our fundamental right to be able to speak the truth about male and female. And another thing that really stuck out was in Section 3, they rebuked the misinterpretation of the Bostock decision. That's often been weaponized against parents like us. And it's exciting to see that that's been shut down, that they're no longer going to be able to use the Bostock decision against our argument.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and Nikki,
yeah.
just to be clear, there was also never a consensus. So
Mm-hmm.
it's really important that, things like the WPATH files and the CAS review get out to the mainstream, because as far as I'm concerned, the mainstream legacy media is just as complicit in this medical scandal by not doing their job and being beholden to activist organizations like the Human Rights Campaign and GLAAD and GLSEN and the Trevor Project and all of these NGOs that were pushing the lie into our society for a very long time. But there was never consensus. And we're starting to see those cards fall, thankfully. But that in itself is even going to take time. And I feel lawsuits.
Yeah, I firmly believe in that. That last part of what you just said is a thing as a physician and a mom that struck with me. Is that and throughout this whole thing, there was never a consensus. It was always this illusion of a consensus. There on how to treat, what's happening to our girls and what's happening to our young children, and whether or not it's even happening at all, whether or not we're putting these ideas in. That's a whole different, like a separate conversation. But yes, I agree. We've been the outlier. The consensus was, initially kind of funneled in from Europe, loosely based on things that European nations were doing. And then the United States just took off and went in a completely, headstrong towards using puberty blockers for any child with a whim or a question about their gender or their sex. And there was never a scientific consensus. There was only a handful of people at organizations that were handpicked or volunteered who decided many of them were members of a lot of those activist organizations and NGOs that you named, and then decided on rules and guidelines and recommendations, and then distributed them to the rest of us and said, this is it. This is the consensus. And so, yeah, that's a big part of it. And I think that these executive orders were actually helpful in just saying, hey, look, this is black and white. This is where we stand on this position. It's very
That's right.
firm. There's no gray, there's no gray area at all. This is what we believe. This is where we're coming from. And this is the basis of where we're starting with every single policy in this administration. And I think that is what was necessary. And the other point that you made, January, is that the US has been an outlier and how it's been responding to the actual scientific data that's been out there. Yes, but now these executive orders and policies of this administration are now making the US the outlier when it comes to a firm position on gender care and gender medicine. Because not even in the CAS review, not even in the UK and other European nations that are going back and reversing their policies, taking away puberty blockers as first line treatment, none of them are flat out giving these definitions about sex, about truth,
Yes.
and making this issue a matter of free speech, and promoting truth and actual science. And so
Well, right.
that's
And calling out WPATH. I mean, that was a
and
huge part of that
specifically calling
executive
out
order,
WPATH.
to
Mhm.
call out WPATH for the activist pseudoscientific organization that it actually is. They should have never been in an authority position of anything to do with medicine. And so that I thought was a very important aspect, which it just shows whoever the amazing person that wrote these executive orders or people, I just celebrate them and congratulate them on bringing truth to light. And I'm very, very hopeful for what is coming from this administration.
It felt like
Absolutely.
with the stroke of a pen, WPATH was delegitimized. And I think in the executive order, they even used the words junk science.
They
And so
did.
I'm really excited and hopeful that the door has been opened for real relevant studies to be conducted, and people like, Lisa Littman, for example, to actually be able to get their research published, because it's not that they haven't been trying, it's just that there hasn't been an opportunity for it to be accepted as truth like WPATH has been.
Yes, that is actually the segue. That's a great segue to my next kind of discussion prompt is, so WPATH, there is a line in the Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation executive order that states that basically rescinds all federal policies relying on guidance from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH. So it basically says, we don't accept anything you're saying. Not one single federal agency is going to use that in our recommendations. We're going to do our own research, devise our own review of the literature, and then and then publish that, right? And so I thought that was just fascinating. But in the response of major medical organizations, medical schools, medical institutions, and sort of, activist groups, but mainly kind of these big bodies that were creating this illusion of consensus. WPATH was actually the only organization that came out with a public statement against the executive orders. I have really been combing through the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Association of Medical Colleges, and kind of the student organizations. I have not seen one press release from any of these organizations. WPATH is the only one that I've seen issue a public statement.
There was one more, Nikki, that you might have missed, but it had to do with schools. It's the American School Counselor Association did release a statement.
Yes, school related ones too, but specifically on this gender order. Oh, I missed that. Okay, I did miss that. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting.
It was quite defiant. It was basically, we're not going to comply.
Well, and they seem to think that they now support parental rights, but in the same breath on their website, they are very clear that children decide who and when to share their gender identity with, and that parents are to be kept in the dark as long as the child wants it that way. So they are still on board with socially transitioning children behind the backs of parents. But to your point with WPATH, I thought it was so ironic, because I have it up, that they said that these healthcare decisions should be guided by evidence-based practices. Their guidelines, which they pushed as standards of care for years, have never been guided by evidence. So, anyone who has read the WPATH files, they did an incredible job with those, getting those out to the public. I still think the vast majority of the public have not seen them, though. Right. And so anyone that looks at those knows that what these doctors and surgeons are doing does not resemble medicine at all. And I think Dr. Eitan Haim said it best when he said they're actually creating disease in healthy individuals. They are not curing anything. This is an issue of the mind that they are attempting to radically treat with interventions on the physical body.
Yeah, that's actually an opinion that I share. Unfortunately, and not everybody sees that, and I think that is that will help us when we start having our discussion about what we think needs to get done too. But the other thing that I saw that we had a little bit of discussion about before we started this webinar was the lawsuit from the ACLU that was targeted, against these executive orders or challenging these executive orders. So I have heard from some parents in blue areas, some in red areas, about local policy, responses. Even though we have not seen large medical organizations making statements outside of WPATH. And so that is one thing that I would like to hear from you guys also, because what is happening at the local level is really the thing that's going to be most directly affecting us and affecting our kids. And so that's the thing that we need to combat. And in a lot of these areas, like where you live, Aaron, the local laws make it really, really difficult to desist, detrans, or to completely avoid, transitioning altogether. So what are you hearing, from parents or from, school boards and local government as a result of the Trump administration orders and policies?
Yeah, I should preface by saying my daughter was affected by a state law that requires licensed counselors to only affirm gender confused youth. So it's forced psychosocial transition. And I didn't understand that law when we took her to a therapist desperately seeking help. And so it's really abundantly clear to me that this, while the federal government's doing everything they can to withhold funding, and we see, like Denver Health, for example, was the first hospital organization to say we're going to pause these surgeries, but they're not going to pause the puberty blockers. And we have the True Center here in Colorado, which is Colorado Children's Hospital, which is the 10th on the Do No Harms, Stop the Harm list. They're number 10, and they're full steam ahead. They haven't made any statements. They haven't updated anything on their website. And, within that executive order, there was one of the sections said that, the AG will be responsible for organizing state attorneys generals to enforce these state mutilation bans. And so it is very clear to me that this is a state and local issue. We have 22 attorney generals that are very blue and will not be complying. I actually have gone toe to toe with my attorney general here in Colorado, who has come out and said he'll do everything he can to fight parents like me and protect trans kids. So it's clear that they're not going to just fold. They're not going to just stop these procedures on children. There is still self-pay, option for people that can go after this kind of care. And I want to also throw out that, as I said, my daughter was affected by psychosocial transition. And these executive orders and these mutilation bans in the states, and what 26 states now, don't cover that. They touch on the physical mutilation aspect, which is really important. It's the most horrific part of transitioning a child. But there is significant damage being caused by psychosocial transition. And so we've got to continue to push that issue and not just eradicate physical mutilation in all 50 states, but also ensure that we're encompassing the social transition and the psychologists who are forced to go along with it and consider the harm that's being caused to kids before they even get to the physical mutilation part.
Yeah. Well, I think honestly, tackling that issue is the cultural issue that we need to be tackling, because if we
Yeah.
can prevent kids from transitioning in the first place, then we'll prevent them from getting to the surgeries and to the chemicals.
And yeah, Aaron's,
then by the time they
yeah.
turn at consenting age, they won't want to do this anymore either. So I
Well,
think,
and Aaron's right. Social transition is not a benign intervention. It's
no.
the first step toward medical intervention, and it really solidifies that false identity in that child's mind, and it affirms, in my case, my daughter's case, it affirmed her own self-hate. And so that is a very important aspect. I know Texas has legislation right now that was just rolled out, and Florida did take steps, thankfully, to stop the social transition of parents. So there are states that do have those laws in place. But you're right, Aaron, we need more. And I think what these executive orders did is it gave states and hospitals coverage that knew this was wrong all along, want to do the right thing and stop. But for those states that are doubling down on this ideology, I think we expected that, especially in states like New York. Their AG just came out and said, let me remind you that state law requires you to provide this chemical castration and mutilation to children. And that's why I'm grateful that President Trump and his administration was very intentional about using the word mutilation, because that's exactly what it is. And so now they can even empower the DOJ to go after some of these hospitals that are providing this mutilation on especially females, because we already had laws on the books against female genital mutilation. And so I think that they're being very proactive, intentional, and really smart about the language they're using and existing laws, because we've all known how unethical this is, that children cannot consent. They don't have the cognitive maturity, yet it's all based on the child's self ID. Both in my daughter's case and Aaron's case, all our daughters had to do is say, I'm trans, whatever that means. They never were asked to define it. For my daughter, it meant she was identifying as non-binary. She didn't even know what that meant. She was 13 years old. And so I really appreciate how intentional the Trump administration is being and how proactive. And we're finally on the offense, because so long we were playing catch up from what these activist organizations had done since 2015.
Mhm. Are you seeing more parents or hearing from more parents who have been quiet about this, or new parents coming out and approaching you, either of you or your organizations, to talk about this and ask for resources?
Big time. Yeah, so we had oral argument in our 10th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals hearing, and there was more than 10 families. It was like standing room only in this little courtroom, who had similar stories. And I had never met any of them before, who were here in Colorado, who caught wind of what was happening and felt like they had stake in this fight against the people who harmed our children. And so I see that they're starting to kind of come out of the shadows and be more vocal about what's happening to them, and be more invested in the fight back, and be more open and asking for resources to help their kids. I'm seeing a lot of parents who previously almost went along with it, or did go along with the social transition, who are starting to wake up and go, okay, I don't have to do that. I've been lied to. I've been told that this is what I have to do for my child, or they'll kill themselves. This suicide myth is so dangerous. It was pushed on me. I'm sure it was pushed on January. These parents are starting to wake up and go, okay, I have another option. There is an alternative to forcibly transitioning my child. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for parents, I want to be clear, it is never too late to walk any decision back. It is never too late. And I can't, my heart breaks for the parents that were lied to by doctors that they trusted, that they saw as experts, that they thought this was evidence-based care that they were giving their child. And so my heart does break, because I can't imagine the amount of cognitive dissonance a parent has to endure to come to the realization that they were duped, that they were lied to, that they bought into a lie that is now harming their child and can cause irreversible medical harm. It's very similar to the cognitive dissonance that detransitioners must endure and go through, to realize that these invasive medical interventions did not cure their root distress. And so my heart does break for those parents.
I often see people blaming the parents for their children. Absolutely, parents should take some responsibility for this. But at the same time, people don't realize that the parents are brainwashed too. That this is this is a part of how the effort to get people to change their ideas about truth, and biological truth, right, has happened, is by slowly infiltrating every single sort of facet of our lives, socially, culturally, to get us to believe these lies, right? And it's happened over time. And so you have that one parent who says, "Oh, well, she just wants to be looked at as, she just wants her name changed. It's nothing. It's not going to be any harm for us to call her by a different name." And then it just sort of starts to gradually evolve into more. The more you give in, the harder it is for you to stop, especially when you have people telling you that you're doing the right thing and making you believe that you're doing the right thing. So it is difficult. It is not a black and white issue for parents. And I would like to see, fewer people outright blaming the parents, for this type of thing.
To answer your question, Nikki, if I can just go back to your original question,
Sure,
I
please.
want to give parents hope too, though, because the landscape from 2020 till now looks completely different. We have made so much progress in getting the truth of these interventions, that we are sterilizing vulnerable children, many of whom are on the autism spectrum, turning them into lifelong medical patients. Because when I woke up to this nightmare in 2020, there was very little information, very little help for people that were cautious about these interventions, cautious about medically transitioning their children, socially transitioning their children, and what that would mean for them. And now, just last week in Kansas, they had more than enough people to testify on our side. And when Florida first started combating this issue, there were two. They had two people speaking on behalf of a bill to restrict medical transitions on minors. So we have come a long way. Over half the country, including Democrats, believe in biological truth, believe this is not okay to do to children. So we have made an incredible amount of progress. And yes, parents are still waking up to the nightmare, but they're also getting to the resources quicker.
And thank you for saying that, Nikki, that we need to put less pressure on parents and blame. It's an impossible situation when your child comes to you with this issue, or when you find out that your child's been struggling with this issue and you were left in the dark about it, which is the case for most parents. I was one of them. I'm so sympathetic because I'm really evidence of the systemic issue and how this has been pushed on people for decades and we didn't realize that it was happening. I studied my undergrad's elementary education in Florida, actually, in a very red area. And I was conditioned to believe that this is the kind, considerate, loving thing to do. If your child says they are something, you must go along with it. I had been conditioned as an elementary teacher to think that that was the right thing to do. And so when this happened in my family, I really was at a crossroads where I almost went along with it. I didn't know how to react. And it was, thank God, my husband, who was the voice of reason, who said, absolutely, we're not going along with this. Thank God for him. But I'm so sympathetic to parents. It truly is an impossible position. And as January said, for a long time, there were no resources. You Google and every single sign points to you must affirm or your child will kill themselves. And we, especially with these executive orders and the science and the data that is going to follow that will, validate real truth and common sense. Parents are really, there's a lot more resources available to them now than there were just a few years ago.
That does not mean that there are not a small amount of parents that have pushed this on their own children.
Oh, yes, correct. We're
So,
not naive to think that. Yeah.
Right. And that, to me, those are few and far between. They make the most noise and are unfortunately exploiting their own children to get attention for themselves. And that is tragic. But I do believe that the vast majority of parents, and I wanted to touch on something that Erin said, because I'm a licensed mental health counselor. And oftentimes I just did a training with counselors in Florida who did not know what the laws were and what their own rights were. Even psychologists, they do not have to affirm a child in this lie. So I want to make that very clear, because exploratory therapy, that is not conversion therapy. And so helping a child to feel comfortable in the reality of their sex is the compassionate, ethical treatment for this issue.
I would also argue that it's informed consent, because what they're getting right now is not informed consent. And
Correct.
Full informed consent means that you are listing the risks, benefits, and alternatives to any type of treatment that you are recommending. An alternative and a viable alternative in this situation is not transitioning. And so that is something that we don't talk about. But so oh my gosh, there's so much to get to here. I think that a lot of what you guys both said about what needs to happen sort of to keep this ball rolling. These are executive orders, right? So we know this isn't permanent law. The next president can come in and change all of this. So what needs to happen at the federal level is some legislation on behalf of our congressmen, but there also needs to be some intervention at the state level as well. And Erin mentioned the attorneys general intervention. I think January you did too in the specifically as it relates to tackling this issue with the brilliant strategy, I think, of using existing laws against female genital mutilation as a way to get in. One of the things that I have pointed out consistently is that the American Academy of Pediatrics has existing policy that prohibits or recommends against not only female genital mutilation, I cannot say that right today, but also tattoos. So, having these policies there that are, counterintuitive to the whole gender affirming care policies, but having these already in existing state laws could be providing some benefit, and especially in blue states like where you are, Erin, where there's already enshrined in your laws that professionals have to go down the path of gender affirming care. But aside from that, what else do you see is necessary from either a legislative or local policy standpoint, or anything that parents can actually do to protect their children? And I want you to answer that thinking about not only children whose parents are like fully involved, children who are intellectually intact, but also thinking about the children and young adults who have autism. Sven Sharpen is in our audience, and he actually asked a question: will I be able to address the crisis happening to autistics in this space? Sven, we don't actually take live, questions or comments, but we can actually talk about, this in the context of answering this question. So what can we do? What should we be seeing out of the next steps out of our Congress, our states, and parent groups to help these kids?
I want to push back just a little bit of what you just said, because I want to make it clear that counselors, teachers, and psychologists do not have to go along with this. That is false. And in fact, the teachers and counselors that are standing up, even in blue states like California, they are winning their lawsuits.
Okay.
And so, unlike parents like myself,
grounds?
free speech and freedom of religion.
Okay.
So they are winning those lawsuits much quicker than the parents are. Erin and I are both still entrenched in our own litigation, and these things take years. And in the meantime, families are literally being destroyed by this ideology. And so I want to make it clear that we need more teachers standing strong. We need more counselors standing up and saying, this is not right. This is not ethical. And you cannot force me to do something that is not in the best interest of a child or a parent-child relationship. So that's, to answer your question, that's one of the first things that needs to happen. But I know that Erin has a lot to offer. Of course, we need Congress to back these executive orders, because you're right. We don't want, God forbid there's a change in leadership. We don't want the next president to just be able to undo all of the important work that the Trump administration is doing. The other thing that I see that's really, really critical is we have got to extend the statute of limitations for when a detransitioner can sue. There is a precious detransitioner by the name of Claire Abernathy that I met. She was transitioned at Dallas Children's. And because their statute of limitations for medical malpractice is only 2 years, this young woman had her breast cut off at age 14. And she is only 20 years old now, has realized this did not help her. It's actually hurt her. And she has no recourse for justice. So that needs to be done across the board. That's a really important aspect. The other thing that I'll say, and then I'll turn this over to Erin, because I know she has a lot to add. Not only do we need a change of culture, we've got to stand up in these blue states. Courage is a Habit posted a call to action today about a school district in Maine that is voting to add a school-based health clinic. And the age of consent in that state is 16. So you have situations where these school clinics are popping up all over our country, and they are very dangerous. They come from the whole child, whole school model. And it's very dangerous because you are putting clinics on school campuses where parents will have very little access to what is happening in these doctors' offices.
Yeah, I can speak to that. We actually have school-based health centers in my school district that harmed my child, and the age of mental health care consent is 12 in Colorado. So they can see these prescribing psychologists with no parent knowledge or consent in their school. The age of consent for physical care is 14, and they're really unabashedly providing gender affirming care in them. I've posted commercials from my district's school-based health center, which they're really open about it. And I agree. Thank you for pointing out the blue states. Like you said, the cultural shift is necessary. Federal law is necessary. Our legislature backing up these executive orders. But the battle is going to be in these blue states like Colorado. And so actually today, Jamie Reed's here to testify for a malpractice insurance bill. It's really common sense. It just gives malpractice insurers the right not to insure a doctor that practices gender affirming care. And we're also running an extension of the statute of limitations to 20 years for detransitioners, because even if we ban gender affirming care in all 50 states, there are still tens of thousands of children who were harmed and have no recourse to fight back for the harm that was caused to them. So we've got to continue pushing these state laws. And I actually, through Protect Kids Colorado, my organization, we run citizens ballot initiatives, which is a process that's only available in 24 states, mostly Midwestern and Western states. But in these blue states where we have a radical supermajority, so we have a super minority of common sense conservative legislators that will even run legislation for us, and they die in committee upon arrival every time. We can't even get amendments through on the bad bills. Like really unconstitutional law is being passed right and left. And so we've taken advantage of this process where citizens can put forth legislation, you obtain a certain amount of signatures, and then it goes on the ballot before we the people. Because I don't think the people that are representing us in these states really speak for the majority. A majority of people, there's studies out now that over 80% of Americans disagree with men and women's sports, with gender mutilation of minors, with parents being lied to. These are very common sense issues that most Americans agree with, and most Coloradans here, even though we're a radically blue state. Every state office is held by a radical Democrat, but
that is true
people
in the state
agree.
of California as well. And I know I did remember that there's a gosh, I'm blanking on Scott's group and his petition. It's Protect Kids something too, and it might be Protect Kids California. But he's one of the board, members for Restore Childhood, where I used to write for, and he started a citizen's position. His group started a citizen's position in the state of California. Unfortunately, the Attorney General in the state of California has the ability to change the name or title of a bill that is put forth by citizens. And they changed the title to something that was, that completely altered the meaning of it. Yeah. And then it got voted down. It didn't pass. It either didn't pass or they didn't get enough petition signatures to put it on the ballot. Either one or the other of those. I can't remember right now. But yeah, that is absolutely a way that parents can actually fight back, and in states like this that have these existing laws. But I do want to ask a little bit more, at least from you, Erin, because January brought this up, that there are people who are fighting at the health professional level on the grounds of this being kind of professional practice and professional freedoms and free speech. But how many of them are doing that and doing it successfully at the state level? I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I want to see what the real view of that are. Are you aware of any of those in the state of Colorado that are happening, or at least in your local area?
It's a handful. I mean, we were talking about our mutual friend, Dr. Travis Morrell, who's a doctor here and a fellow with Do No Harm. And he's actually the one that put that idea into the universe about female gender mutilation being illegal, and that we should set that as a standard, that gender affirming care is female gender mutilation. And radical students from the University of Colorado were rallied to come out and vote against it. And so while most doctors agreed with him and were prepared to vote along with him, these students came out and completely shifted the vote. So that tells me that most doctors, they get it. They agree that this is wrong, but they're afraid to speak up. And so it's only a handful that are. But I wanted to point out too, I know in Florida, it's not illegal for a counselor to coach a child through being comfortable in their biological sex. In Colorado, it is. And so there's a case that's sitting before the Supreme Court right now, Chiles versus Salazar. And that's a counselor who, on her religious and free speech grounds, is saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be forced to affirm a child and their confusion over their sex. And so I submitted an amicus. It's our hope that they will take up this case. It's a pivotal case for free speech and for doctors and therapists having that ability to speak up. But I would encourage them to do it anyway. It is unconstitutional. It is wrong. And therapists, they've been trained to help their patient in the best way they know how. And affirming them in their self-hatred is not what they've been trained to do. So I hope that these cases and these doctors speaking up encourage more people. You know, courage is contagious. I hope more doctors will continue to do the right thing and speak up publicly about it.
Yeah,
In
I
the
think that's
meantime,
gonna be the key. It's the courage. And
yeah.
if these executive orders give people hope and courage and a ground to stand on, what they believe in, then yeah, I do have hope that it actually will inspire more people to be courageous and take those steps in places like this. So that's where I absolutely agree with you, January,
Well,
on
and
that.
even in Colorado and California, there is a workaround. You know, Aaron and I think we're on the same page that the vast majority of these kids, they don't need therapy. They need parents setting healthy, appropriate boundaries and
That's 100%
reestablishing
where I live.
trust with their own children. Because when the school interfered in my relationship with my child, what it really was parental alienation. They alienated my child from me as the parent and sent a very clear message to her that she needed to be protected from me and not by me. So it took us a great deal of time to repair that connection. But what a lot of therapists are doing in California and New York are offering parent coaching. And that to me really is the right model for this issue.
Yes,
Unless there's other
absolutely.
co-occurring issues, which there often is, if the child is suffering from self-harm or anorexia, then yes, get those issues treated. But to me, a lot of this distress over their sex is very reminiscent of eating disorders and the disassociation you see from their sexed bodies. I am firmly in the belief that this is a mental health issue that has been pushed and promoted and normalized to our children. And
Yeah,
I saw it firsthand with my daughter. It is not normal for a 13-year-old girl to suddenly think cutting her breast off is the answer to pubescent angst. That is
yeah.
not normal. And so to fully inoculate these kids, we at the same time of fighting, the systemic indoctrination of all of our institutions, we have to be teaching our children the truth from a young age, early, often in age appropriate ways, so that when they're exposed to the lies, they know that these are lies.
Yeah, what you mentioned is really important. There's multiple layers to this. There is the truth, infection of the lies that are spread from every layer, even from the time they are in preschool and in every cultural institution. There's also the parental boundaries and interference and availability to their children. Parents don't get to go and be scapegoats about this. We do allow some things, kids, that when we allow our kids to not have boundaries and not have rules and have free exposure to all of these things, we do need to take some responsibility there too. So I think the parent coaching is key, and I'm a little biased because that's actually some of the work I do on the side. So I absolutely agree with that. But it is a cult. It is a cult mentality that we actually have to release ourselves and our children from, and it has to reach every single layer here, at the political level, at the medical and health professional level, and in the schools. And so I think a lot of what
And the
you
judicial system. We
and the
cannot forget. I mean, Jamie Reed
yeah,
has been very open
yeah,
about how she herself went and indoctrinated judges into
yeah,
this same false belief system. And we are
yeah,
seeing
yes,
the repercussions of that from some of these rulings. So it's really important that we include judges when we're talking about the institutional capture.
Great point.
And
Absolutely.
to your point, Nikki, the primary tenet of any cult is to isolate the person in the cult from their family. And this assumption that parents are all guilty until proven innocent, which is what's happening in classrooms in every single state across the country. That's what happened to January. And I really speaks to the malicious nature of this cult, that they are intentionally separating our children from us because we are the front line of defense. We are the primary caregiver, provider, and we have the greatest ability to protect and heal our children. And they know it. So their first step is to isolate children from their families.
Yes, awesome. Okay, we got a great, and so since we're talking about this and just sort of that, how do we encourage our teenagers and our young children not to believe in this ideology? We actually have a question related to that, an audience question from Patricia Weir-Kuhn. She is in Australia. Thank you for joining us, Patricia. And she writes, "Good morning from Australia. What information do you think would help children to resist the ideology? What would have helped your children? Asking because we are, Australia, are far behind you, and we are looking to develop a resource for teens and preteens to help them identify the lies of the ideology and for the parents."
I can speak to the littles. So when this happened with my daughter, I had a 6-year-old and a newborn, now 4 and 10 years old. And so we were faced with this struggle of, I don't want to talk to them about gender identity and sexuality, but they're going to be faced with it from every facet of our society. And so, as January put it, we have to inoculate them from this ideology. And I boiled it down into 4 things. 1, safe adults don't ask you to keep secrets. Doesn't matter if they teach you the ABCs and say keep it a secret, they're not safe. 2, no one should ask you to label yourself. You're a child, you're figuring it out. You don't need a political party, you don't need any label. You're free to be you, whatever that is. 3, there's only male and female. Boys cannot become girls, girls cannot become boys, and there's no wrong way to be male or female. You're a little boy, you might want to wear a pink shirt or grow your hair. You're still a boy. You can't change that. And then 4th, as a believer, I teach my kids that, we are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God. He only made us male and female, and there's nothing wrong with that.
And what do you guys say to the people who think that there are some kids who are true trans? Because that is often some of the criticism that I get for my own personal opinions on this. Because first of all, I think people need to understand that it's not clear that there is no scientific study or research into what we call desisting children, which is the act of helping them to accept their bodies as they are and accepting their sex for this truth that we're speaking of. There's no research. It's almost like the word doesn't even exist in the medical literature and the scientific language. I've seen a few journalists, Abigail Schreier maybe, speak about desistance, but it is not really something that is a prevalent part of the conversation here. And so there is no science to this. So for people who have been taught, and at least on the activist side of things and the gender affirming care side of things, they will tell us that desistance is conversion therapy, or it is harmful, or it is sending kids down a pathway, towards suicide. We have to have an answer for them. For this particular group, are there children who actually go on to believe that they are trans without some sort of input from the external environment, without social media, without internet, without doctors and teachers and parents telling them that? And if so, what is the proper, what should we be doing for those kids that you think of? You don't have to have an answer for this. It's just,
I have a lot of answers for this, Nikki. I mean,
okay.
Especially as a mental health professional, I was trained in this issue. Now, when I was trained in the late 90s, we weren't using language like gender fluid, non-binary, demigirl. There weren't 72 different gender identities for these kids to choose from. So you have to separate what was clinically gender identity disorder versus what we are seeing now with the large amount of girls and boys suddenly believing they were born in the wrong body. First of all, we need to stop using the word trans, especially transgender. There's no such thing. You have kids that, at a very early age, it was statistically mostly boys who would experience distress over their sexed body. And it could be for a variety of reasons. But when you said we have no research, that's actually not true. We have a lot of research from Dr. Kenneth Zucker, who was crucified for his position of watchful waiting. And when his position of watchful...
No. When I say there's no research on desistance, I mean, watchful waiting to me is not desistance. It's a very different,
Okay.
it's a very different thought process. That's
sure. Okay, so his position, his clinical position was give these kids time and the vast majority will resolve their distress. I believe it was upwards of 80%. You're right in that we don't have any information or research on this new cohort, and we can't turn back time. So because this has been so normalized and pushed into every aspect of our society, it's never going to look the same again, if that makes any sense. We're always going to have this cohort now that has been manipulated from a very young age to believe that we have a so-called internal sense of gender that can be separate from our sex and that they actually choose to be a boy, girl, neither or both. I mean, that's the lie, the tenets of gender identity ideology. But what I would say to the people that believe there's such a thing as someone born in the wrong body is get them to define what that means. Because when you get them to actually define what that means, they can't do it without relying on very regressive sex stereotypes. And so what I tell people is that people are born male or female. Their expression and how they choose to present themselves, or likes, dislikes, preferences in terms of masculine or feminine traits, that is their personality. That has no bearing on any identity because sex is binary. And so we have to bring people back to that fundamental truth. And the best way to do that is to get them to define it without using sex stereotypes.
That's brilliant. Awesome. What do you think, Erin? Do you have any thoughts about that at all?
Well, just to add to that, like our friend Billboard Chris says, there are two sexes, zero genders, and infinite personalities. I would encourage people to stop using the word gender. I don't believe it exists. It was a word that was created to define, language,
Roles.
gendered
Yeah,
language.
gender roles, right.
So I would encourage people to stop using it. But I'm glad you made the analogy earlier about anorexia because, I have great sympathy for girls who think they were born in the wrong body. They think they are too heavy, they are too fat, but we don't affirm them in that belief that their body is wrong. We help them through their mental health distress. And I do think there are people who, from a very early age, have gender distress. Again, I have great empathy for them, but that doesn't mean that we hack off their healthy body parts and affirm their mental health distress. As you said, most people will work their way through it if left alone. But for those with very serious cases, we need to take that seriously and help them to be comfortable in their body, just like we wouldn't, give an anorexic girl drugs to be skinnier. We shouldn't be affirming them in their mental health distress.
And
Yeah,
even for those
I
kids
think
that
the way
had
to-
true sorry,
Mhm.
go ahead, Nikki.
I think the way to do that is actual intentional desistance training and coaching. And that means, and when you look at, using the analogy of anorexia and bulimia, there is research into behavioral therapies that you can use to help these young ladies, right, to go through this process. And so that is, to me, that is one of the pieces that's missing out of the executive orders and the language here. We talked about support for detransition, right?
Yes.
We talked about increasing or lengthening the statute of limitations for people who are harmed to actually bring forth lawsuits against the people who did them harm. And then we talked about erasing the ideology, but we actually don't have a process that is lined. There are a couple of groups and organizations that are out there doing that work, but it still needs some sort of backing with research, right? a strategy that uses well-known behavioral therapies, family therapies, addiction recovery type of coaching, those types of things, because a lot of this, like we said, is being addicted to a cult, addicted to devices, addicted to people affirming you, and social media. All of those things are involved. I think we do need a strategy that actually combines all of these things into, whatever we want to call it. Distance therapy, recovery therapy, gender
Yeah,
ideology,
I mean, we also
whatever.
need guidelines for detransitioning. There are
Yes,
no guidelines
yes,
right now. And so, you have these individuals who've been grossly harmed by the medical and psychological communities. And so, of course, they have a distrust, but they have all this help when they want to so-called transition.
yeah,
Then when they want to go back to living as the reality of their sex, there is no help. In
yeah,
fact, there is shame, there's gaslighting, there's all kinds of negative things that happen to these individuals who are already traumatized, many of whom still have the root distress that caused them to believe they were born in the wrong body, that caused them to believe this was the answer. And so not only do we need guidelines for these individuals in terms of going off of the puberty blockers, the cross-sex hormones, but Colin Wright wrote a very important piece, and he said that defining sex is not enough. We need states to pass laws to not be able to alter your birth certificates. There are
mhm,
still very practical things that need to happen. And I spoke to a detransitioner just last week, and he was having a difficult time getting his sex changed. Now, this is a man, by the way, full beard, bald, like an older gentleman, and it still says female on his driver's license. And what happened was is they were using the same criteria for him to go back to the reality of his sex as to change the sex. So they were telling him he needed a court order or a
okay,
letter from a surgeon after getting surgery. And he was like, here's my birth certificate. I'm male. But it complicates. This is what I'm talking about. This
yeah,
entire
yeah,
ideology has created chaos because also in that same state, they have the ability to alter their sex on the birth certificate.
yes,
So
yeah,
when you allow that, Florida stopped that, thankfully. You have situations where we don't even know what the true sex of this person is because there was no indication on the birth certificate that it had ever been altered.
yeah. That
This is a
is
health
that is
hazard.
the dilemma
Doctors
that I'm
treat
in here
Well,
males and
too.
it's
females
fraud.
differently.
It's fraudulent. This
Yeah.
is this is what they are doing is fraud. We cannot change our sex. That should have never, ever been allowed.
Well, you would think that the process would be similar to reverse to getting a divorce and going back to your maiden name, how people do that legally. It's very interesting how that is a unique legal
Yeah.
challenge for people, and that's not something that people are bringing up. So add that to the
But
list,
right.
right?
But again, if you can't trust what the birth certificate says because you're able to alter it and there's no proof, I mean, it's complete chaos right now. The other
Yeah,
thing that I think is really needed is a reporting mechanism. We have to have very clear ways of reporting hospitals and schools that are breaking these executive orders. And I'm so grateful we haven't talked about the whistleblower clause, the protecting of the whistleblowers. I think
mhm.
is going to be critically important moving forward for people that want to blow the whistle and say, my hospital is still harming children in this way. Because I do believe, as much as we're celebrating these hospitals coming out saying we're pausing or we're stopping, they may quietly start again and nobody will know.
Can you expand on that a little bit more? Because I know, Bear has been very supportive of Do No Harm, Stop the Harm database. Can you talk a little
Yes.
bit more about that and if there are any avenues for people to report?
Yes.
Okay.
So Stop the Harm database was an incredible database that Do No Harm put out. You can go to stoptheharmdatabase.com because for so many years, these hospitals, including Boston Children's, were claiming that they were not operating on minors. That was a lie. So now we know from the data that Do No Harm collected from various resources, specifically how many surgeries, how many prescriptions were written for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And you can go state by state and see the biggest hospitals, and we're talking millions of dollars from 2019 to 2022, I believe it was. It's almost $120 million that they have been bringing in to chemically castrate and mutilate children. So, that's a really important aspect of all of this is the money, but we're also already seeing people stating, well, my endocrinologist changed my diagnosis from gender dysphoria to endocrine disorder. So you better believe that these ideological doctors are going to find ways to continue to harm these children. And we need a mechanism, a reporting mechanism, so that we can expose this, and those hospitals will lose their federal funding and schools.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. And you also brought up another point that I don't think that we've fully touched on. We talked about the support structures for people who are desisting or detransitioning, but we haven't actually talked about the medical side of things and the medical billing side of things. There are no existing procedure codes or diagnosis codes for desistance or detransition. And so that is something that absolutely needs to happen too. I know particularly the American Medical Association actually owns the procedure codes. So do either of you know anyone who is working on this particular part of the issue and getting this covered under insurance plans?
I do. They are not public with their information yet, so you will have to stay tuned. But there are people
Fine, at least I
working
know
on
that
that behind the scenes.
okay,
Yeah.
awesome.
And Do No Harm does have an anonymous tip line. So until these reporting mechanisms are in place through the Trump administration or DOJ or whoever it's going to be, feel free to use our anonymous tip line at Do No Harm, and we will get that information to the correct people.
Fantastic. That is great. Okay, I think that is, I mean, those are all the questions that I had. Oh, wait, I think we do have another. Patricia Weirkoon has another question that she wants to ask. Aaron, you said you're a Christian. We have a book on the gender issue. This is what we are building on with the teens and parents. Resources to follow. Would be delighted to send you a copy. It's called matthiasmedia.com, and she puts the link in here, so there you can get to that. But for anybody else, I'm gonna post it. We're answering this live so people can see the link. Thank you for sharing that, Patricia. That's awesome.
So important. So
Yeah.
important. And I realized one thing I didn't mention that I always tell parents too is to teach kids to trust your instinct while you're compiling information for that book. And that goes for parents as well. Instinctually, when this happened to me, I knew it was wrong. But the world told me to go along with it. And so I had this push-pull of, well, this is what I'm supposed to do, but instinctually I know I can't push my daughter down this path. And so I think it's really imperative that we teach our kids to trust their instinct. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And I've taught my sons that they have the authority to get up and remove themselves from something that doesn't feel right. So when my daughter was in this art club and it didn't feel right, she didn't feel like she could leave. The authoritative figures were in charge of the situation. And so it's important to teach our kids that they have the authority to remove themselves from something that just doesn't feel right.
Well, and parents need to take back their authority too. I just spoke to a parent out in Massachusetts, and this poor man lost his wife to cancer. Daughter fell prey to the ideology, and he thought he was doing the right thing by leaving his daughter alone with his trusted female pediatrician because his daughter was starting puberty. Next thing he knows, he's being referred to Fenway Gender Clinic. And so it's really important parents know you can no longer leave your child alone with the pediatrician or the doctor. You need to opt them out of any questionnaires that are going to ask them about gender, identity, sexual orientation. That is not why you were at the doctor. So parents need to rightfully take back their authority, just like you were alluding to, Nikki, with this, I'm sure through parent coaching, a lot of what you are doing is helping parents to have their rightful authoritative role within their own family and set healthy boundaries for their children. And Dr. Leonard Sachs talks a lot about the collapse of parenting and why we are starting to see the repercussions of that. I do want to touch on what Patricia said, separate from my role at Do No Harm, I co-authored a church guide meant for both pastors and parents. And she can look that up at parentchildrights.org. It's called the Church Transgender Response Guide. And in the appendix, I actually wrote a chapter on how to parent your child through this. So that guide is very comprehensive because it goes into what gender identity ideology is, what churches and parents could be doing to safeguard their children from it, and then also what to do if your child falls prey. Because the other aspect that we haven't touched on is the threat of child protective services. So there's a chapter in there as well. There are parents that are terrified that CPS is going to remove their children from their care. And that is a threat in states that is unimaginable to me. Imagine having your child removed from you, which this is happening because you want to protect them from medical mutilation. That is unfathomable, but that is where we are in some states in our country right now.
That's actually part of our story. So when we pulled our daughter out of the harmful environment of her sixth grade classroom, they involved a mandated reporter for a well child check on the well-being of our child. Because if we're not affirming her, surely we're abusive. And I learned a few really important things in the process. I didn't understand my rights at the time, that I did not have to let child protective services into my home. I now caution all parents, CPS is not welcome into your home without a warrant. You can bring your child to the window, they can wave and show everyone that they're fine, but they are not welcome in your home without a warrant. And if they do show up, there's two wonderful law firms that are there to help, the Child and Parental Rights Campaign, which represents January, and the Pacific Justice Institute, Brad Dacus's group, that both have 24/7 helplines for anyone who is currently being faced with child protective services. And this is happening to hundreds and hundreds of parents in red and blue states alike.
That is excellent advice, and excellent practical advice for parents. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's awesome. And Patricia is actually asking for, oh, it looks like, okay. Gavin, you are so good. Gavin's our technical support here. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Just answered Patricia's is asking for the link for in the chat for what you talked about January. So that's pretty awesome. So, all right. That is in there. Either of you have any, I mean, it's about time that we wrap up. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think this is fantastic. I think we've touched on things that not a lot of people are talking about at all, and how to solve this issue. I think it's been absolutely wonderful. So are there any final words or any closing thoughts that you would like to leave the FAIR audience with on this particular issue? Give some advice on what they can do, what parents can do, what local leaders can do to help move things along so that we're supporting children and preventing them from getting harmed by gender medicine.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Erin.
I always end with, practical advice that the most influence anyone can have is in their own sphere of influence. It's in their own community. And when parents say, I don't know where to start, I say, well, pay attention to your school board, because so much happens at the local level. Like, I live in a local control state where they have full authority over everything that happens in our school district. So pay attention to what's happening in your schools. Find like-minded parents, join a Moms for Liberty or a local parent or grandparent group. Grandparents are really, really active in this movement. I work with more grandparents than parents on getting out there and making change in our community. So find like-minded people, do research, and pay attention to what's happening at the local level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the thousands of parents who have young adult children who are also falling prey to the lies of this ideology. And, Do No Harm's focus is on protecting minors. And I think that is absolutely the right place we need to start. But, we have zero safeguarding for even young adults. And if it's bad medicine for a 16-year-old, it doesn't magically become good medicine for an 18 or 19-year-old. And so, I would love to see this administration go after Planned Parenthood. They are giving out testosterone and estrogen with no safeguarding whatsoever. We don't have proper assessments happening with any of these kids, including the young adults. And so I just want to leave parents with hope. Even if you have a young adult, I have seen miracles happen in the last 6 months. And, the best thing that you can do is, a lot of these kids are going what's called no contact. They're being brainwashed to believe that if their parents don't immediately affirm them in this trans identification, that they don't love them. And the opposite is just the truth. You know, you can stand firm in truth from a place of love and compassion for your child. Keep the lines of communication open as best as you can. And a lot of these kids that had gone no contact for years, where parents had lost hope, are now coming home. And so I think that that is just incredible to see. And I just want to leave other parents with hope that inoculate your young children, but also have the hope that you are the expert of your child and you can walk your child through this confusion. It takes a lot of work. It takes the ability to sit in conflict with your child, but it's possible.
Absolutely. I think that's beautiful. I couldn't say it any better. I also want to just encourage people to get involved at their local level, learn what the laws are in their school district, learn what the laws are at their state level, get to know your own legislatures, make a phone call that's 5 minutes to just say, hey, I'm a parent who's interested in this issue. I'd like to have a moment to talk with you about this. Those are ways that you can be proactive and be involved and work on behalf of your child. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank my wonderful panelists, Erin Lee and January Littlejohn. I want to remind you all that Fair for All is run entirely on donations from people like all of you who are attending. We strive to offer programming and educational information that helps bring awareness and solutions with the aim of returning to an emphasis on Hippocratic medicine, which is providing holistic care that minimizes harm and emphasizes benefit. We hope that you will consider supporting FAIR with a donation. To find out more about our work, please go to fairforall.org. To donate directly, fairforall.org/donate. The links that we discussed today are in the chat, and in the show notes will take you directly to all of the information that we shared, and ways to donate to FAIR. Thank you all for, again, Erin and January, for joining me and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Nikki.